love the fact that now the people just get up to take the offering during the second song and I don't have to worry about it. Generally, we got to the last song and there's a lady called Dot used to sit on the front row and she'd wave at me frantically from the front row, and it would be because we haven't taken an offering all service, so we quite often in the last song. So yeah, some things never change. So we have got to get the notices in. But we're going to look over the next couple of weeks at the women in Jesus' family tree. We're going to look, who are they and why are they there? I wonder how many of you have ever noticed them. The genealogy of Jesus is in the very first chapter of the very first book of the New Testament. It's in Matthew 1. It's the bit we normally skip. If you've got an old-fashioned Bible, it's all begats and all sorts, and then we go, oh yeah, move on to the interesting bit. But actually, this is fascinating if you have a look. So it starts, Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac was the father of Jacob. Jacob was the father of Judah and his brothers. And Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. And so we reach the first of the 4 women that we're going to be looking at through this series: Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba. We're going to be having a look at them in the lead up to Christmas. And I said we have to go right back to Genesis chapter 38 for Tamar's story. And I do honestly think that this sermon this morning should come with a PG rating, I'll be honest. Probably actually, what's the next one? 13, is it? 12? 12. What's the one after that? 15. And then it's 18. Yeah. I mean, I'd have it as X-rated, but you know, things have changed now. So Genesis 38, 1 to 30. I was going to get a volunteer to read this. I thought, I can't spring this on someone unwittingly. Genesis 38, can you tell I'm a bit nervous about reading this out to you? Genesis 38, verse 1 to 30. At that time, Judah left his brothers and went down to stay with a man of Adullam named Hira. There Judah met the daughter of a Canaanite man named Shua. He married her and made love to her. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son who was named She conceived again and gave birth to a son and named him Onan. She gave birth to still another son and named him Shelah. It was at Kezib that she gave birth to him. Judah got a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, sleep with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law to raise offspring for your brother. But Onan knew that the child would not be his. So whenever he slept with his brother's wife, he spilt his semen on the ground to avoid providing offspring for his brother. What he did was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death also. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, live as a widow in your father's household until my son Shelah grows up, for he thought he may die too, just like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's household. After a long time, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. When Judah had recovered from his grief, he went up to Timnah to the men who were shearing his sheep, and his friend Hira the Adullamite went with him. When Tamar was told, your father-in-law is on his way to Timnah to shear his sheep, she took off her widow's clothes, covered herself with a veil to disguise herself, and then sat down at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah, for she saw that, though Shelah had grown up, she had not been given to him as his wife. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. Not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law, he went over to her by the roadside and said, come now, let me sleep with you. And what will you give me to sleep with you? She asked. I'll send you a young goat from my flock, he said. Will you give me something as a pledge until you send it? She asked. He said, what pledge should I give you? Your seal and its cord and the staff in your hand, she answered. So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. After she left, she took off her veil and put on her widow's clothes again. Meanwhile, Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adullamite in order to get his pledge back from the woman, but he did not find her. He asked the men who lived there, "Where is the shrine prostitute who was beside the road at Enaim?" "There hasn't been any shrine prostitute here," they said. So he went back to Judah and said, "I didn't find her. Besides, the men who lived there said there hasn't been any shrine prostitute here." Then Judah said, "Let her keep what she has, or we will become a laughingstock. After all, I did send her this young goat, but you didn't find her." About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar is guilty of prostitution, and as a result, she is now pregnant." Judah said, "Bring her out and let her be burned to death." As she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law. "I am pregnant by the man who owns these," she said. And she added, "See if you recognize whose seal and cord and staff these are." Judah recognized them and said, "She is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her to my son Shelah." And he did not sleep with her again. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. As she was giving birth, one of them put out his hand. So the midwife took a scarlet thread and tied it on his wrist and said, "This one came out first." But when he drew back his hand, his brother came out, and she said, "So this is how you have broken out." And he was named Perez. Then his brother, who had the scarlet thread on his wrist, came out, and he was named Zerah. I think that's a pretty self-explanatory passage, really. I don't think I need to go into too much detail in explaining this. Really, though, we can't just dive into this head first. There's so much in there. So let's have a little bit of history. How on earth did we get to this point? Okay, back in Genesis chapter 12, really famous passage where God calls Abraham to leave his land and to leave his people and to follow God. And it's where he first gives Abraham the promises that Abraham will be the father of a great nation and Abraham will be a blessing to many. It all stems back to Abraham in Genesis 12. So God called Abraham to leave his land and his people and follow God. And God made promises to Abraham. So Abraham then has a son called Isaac. With me so far. Isaac marries Rebekah, and they have twin boys, Esau and Jacob. You remember the story of Esau and Jacob? Again, it's another really famous one. Esau, the eldest, sells his birthright to Jacob for a bowl of stew. And when he's older, Jacob wrestles with God, and it throws his hip out, and his name is changed to Israel. And that's how the nation gets their name, the nation of Israel. Okay, so Jacob/Israel, same person. Jacob is the father of 12 sons and at least one daughter. So he is the father of Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Joseph, and Benjamin. Now you've heard of Joseph, one of the 12 sons, because he's the one who had the coat of many colours. You with me? Okay. And Judah, who we are talking about today, is an older brother of Joseph of the famous coat. So if ever there was a dysfunctional family, this was it. 12 sons, 4 mums. There was jealousy, favouritism, and serious trouble between the brothers. But let's face it, from start to finish, this is a weird story. But in some ways, it feels like it's a bit of a diversion from the important stuff that's going on, which is the story of Joseph. If you've got your Bibles open, flick back a chapter to chapter 37. And you'll see that chapter 37 is all about Joseph. He's going to his brothers, he's showing off, and they get so sick of him that they plot to kill him, but instead they end up throwing him down a well and selling him as a slave to some Egyptians that come past. So that's what immediately precedes this passage. And then the chapter after this, which is Genesis 39, so if you flicked on a bit, it picks up again with Joseph, and it's all about Joseph with Potiphar's wife, when he refuses to commit adultery, and then he's accused of rape, and he's thrown into prison in Egypt. So you've got the Joseph story building and continuing, and then in the middle, this really odd passage. And it feels like an odd chapter in an odd place, but actually, it's a vitally important story. Because even though Joseph, of the Technicolor Dreamcoat fame, is the really famous one that everyone's heard of, it's not through Joseph that Jesus will come, but from Judah that Jesus will come. It's ultimately from the descendants of Judah that salvation will come to the whole world. But as I said, as a dysfunctional family, they are completely off the scales. And Judah, well, he decides he's had enough. He's had enough. Joseph has been sold into slavery, and that would have devastated their father. And so Judah, for whatever reason, decides he's had enough and he's off. And so off he goes, leaving behind his father, his brothers, and all of his family responsibilities. He just takes off. And he married a Canaanite woman. So the great-grandson of Abraham, the son of the promise to build a new nation, runs away from that promise. And he steps deliberately and purposefully right out of the will of God for his life. And just like Joseph, the Joseph story that surrounds this, the story of Judah, it just takes a long time, doesn't it, to bubble through. It takes a long time for things to start to happen. Judah's run off and he's got married, and he has 3 sons, Onan and Shelah. 2 of them are grown up, 1 is very young. And his eldest son, I always wonder, did he get to the naming ceremony? And the priest says, "Judah, what are you naming your first child?" And Judah goes, and he goes, "From now on, this child shall be called, But has grown up and has married a woman called Tamar. But before Tamar can have children, dies. And this leaves Tamar in an incredibly tricky position. You see, there was no such thing as welfare state or social security or universal credit. As a woman, she is not entitled to own anything, any property or anything in her own right, in her own name. She has nothing. She is totally dependent on the care and the generosity of the men around her. And according to the laws and the customs, if a husband dies before the wife has children, then the wife is given to the next son along, whether either of them like that idea or not, to be quite frank. So Tamar finds herself given to Onan, the middle son. But Onan, well, he doesn't want to give Tamar children because he knows that she is still technically married to his brother, even though his brother is dead. So any children that Onan gives to Tamar will be considered children and will therefore be in line for the inheritance before Onan. Very complicated. Onan says, blow that. I'm not losing my inheritance to her children. I'm not giving her children. Onan denied Tamar her right to children, but ultimately he didn't gain anything at all because he also then died. Cheery story, this. And it gets worse, because then Judah behaves appallingly. Judah's responsibility to Tamar as her father-in-law should have been to take care of her, to take her in to his family as a daughter until his youngest son is old enough to marry her. But he doesn't. Instead, he casts her aside. He sends her back to her parents, childless, destitute, twice widowed, with no insurance for her old age, and nothing but a bleak future ahead of her. And time passes, long enough that Sheila is now grown up, and it's become obvious that Judah is not going to fulfill his duty and his obligation to Tamar. He's not going to do the right thing. He's not going to do what he should do to try and provide a future and an inheritance for Tamar, children to look after her and take care of her and provide for her in her old age. So he's cast her aside. And so Tamar has no choice but to take matters into her own hands. I have heard a lot of sermons that absolutely cut Tamar into the ground for the way that she behaves. But actually, when it becomes obvious that Judah is not going to fulfill his duty, she feels that she has no choice but to take matters into her own hands. And then the story, if it could even get weirder, gets very weird. So Tamar hears that Judah is going to be at a certain place, and we read that she takes off her widow's clothes. So that gives us the impression, actually, that she has been a woman of she's fulfilled her side of the bargain. She's been reliable. She has been trustworthy and honest and done everything that was asked of her. She has waited at home in her widow's clothes, patiently waiting for Sheila to send for her. And she has waited a long time. So she takes off her widow's clothes and covers her face. Remember, it probably would have been a lot of years since Judah had ever even seen her. And she risks everything. And she dresses as a temple prostitute. And we read in our passage that when she was there, Judah approached her, and then he slept with her, and she became pregnant. But Tamar is no one's fool. She asks for something that belongs to Judah until she receives payment. And so Judah gives her his staff, his cord, and his seal. Basically, it's the equivalent of giving his driving license or his passport today. This is absolute proof of his identity. If she showed these, people would know that these belong to Tamar. They could belong to no one else. To Judah, thank you. Glad you're awake. And then Tamar goes back home to her parents' house, and she waits. The thing is, with being pregnant, you can generally only conceal it for so long, can't you? So word gets back to Judah that his daughter-in-law, who is supposed to be living a chaste life in mourning, is pregnant. And even worse, it's because she was a prostitute. And then come the most incredible double standards I've ever come across in my entire life. Judah, who had slept with Tamar unwittingly, thinking she was a shrine prostitute, says, "She must be burned. Bring her out." Actually, the law does say she should be burned. If you want to wade through Leviticus, Deuteronomy, it's in there. But Tamar sends a message to Judah. "I'm pregnant by the man who owns these." And Judah realizes that he has been caught and confronted by his own double standards and this woman that he has mistreated. And he says, "She has behaved more righteously than me." And so he does the right thing, eventually. He takes her back into his home to take care of her, and she gives birth to twin boys, Perez and Zerah. And that is where our story breaks off. Our chapter breaks off, and we rejoin the story of Joseph in Egypt. But actually, at the end, Tamar has been restored to Judah's family, and Judah has learned his lesson. Actually, the next time we hear of Judah, the next time we hear his name mentioned, it's actually he's back with his family. He's back with his father and his brothers, and he's travelling to Egypt with them all to escape the famine. And so after this huge diversion, we get this sense that Judah, he's gone off and he's had this huge diversion. But after all of this, he is restored to the heart of his family, eventually. And we have this sense of God working his purposes out. And that's also the story, the theme that runs through the Joseph story, isn't it? You know, what his brothers intended for harm, God has used for good. We say that quite often when we read the Joseph story. And so we get this theme again and again and again in the detail of Judah and Tamar's story. And then ultimately in the bigger story of Joseph, which meant that all of his family and their relatives were saved from the famine. And then finally in the grand salvation narrative that will lead to the birth, death, and resurrection of Jesus. God is working his purposes out. And I said at the beginning that this chapter, this very odd chapter, this snippet of Judah and Tamar is incredibly important because it is from Judah and from Tamar that the line will continue through King David and ultimately to Jesus. Judah is the one from whom the whole nation of Jews take their name. And we know that the Bible calls Jesus the Lion of Judah. And so we see that God is working his purposes out in individuals and in his people as a whole. This is all coming together like the ingredients of a cake, all being baked together. You see, Judah was not big enough to derail God's plans for him or for his people. I wonder if you've ever thought that you've made such a complete and utter mess of everything, that you have sat there and thought, I have completely derailed God's plans for me. Well, I've got news for you. You're not big enough to do that. Kind of reminds me of when I was younger. God called me to leadership in the church when my Mark, was 2 years old. 2 years old. I ran away, as you do. Mark was 11 when I finally stopped running away from God. 9 years. 9 years of saying no. 9 years of trying to go in the opposite direction. But I was not big enough to derail God's plans for me. Doesn't mean that there weren't times, there haven't been times, and there will still be times when it seemed like I had completely messed everything up. But God was working his purposes out despite me. And so this story, the story of Tamar and of Judah, is actually, it's odd, but it's such a story of reassurance for me. And for any of us, actually, who have children, or brothers and sisters, or family members that seem to be making a mess of everything, or even you feel like they're deliberately walking away from God's plans for their life, it's a reassurance for me to keep praying for those that we love, to keep trusting God that they are not big enough to derail God's plans for them. And that just like Judah, they will be restored to God. I mean, poor Jacob in the middle of this, the father. He thinks that Joseph is dead and at least one son has gone away. But still, in this most dysfunctional of families, God is still at work. These are the children of promise, literally the great-grandchildren of the promise made to Abraham. These are the children who will become a great nation. These are the children from whom the tribes will get their names, and the whole nation of Israel will get their names, because God is faithful to his promises even when we are not. He is faithful even when we run away. God is faithful even when we deliberately do everything we possibly can to break our side of the deal. If you think that you've made a mess of your life, you need to hear these words. You are not big enough. In all things, God works together for good. Doesn't mean that life is always a bed of roses, but it does mean that God is in control and he is working out his purposes. Our God is a faithful God who is working out his purposes, who is fulfilling his promises. And so this morning, my question to you, what are the promises that you're standing on? What are the things that God promised to you, maybe even years ago, that you are still waiting and hoping for? What are the things that God is calling you to that you keep saying, no, Lord, I can't? Who are the people that you are trusting God for today? Keep trusting in our awesome God. And so Tamar is the first of our Advent women. She's the first woman mentioned in Jesus' family tree. Tamar, shrine prostitute, ancestor of King David, and ultimately of Jesus. Shall we pray?